A quick disclaimer, I want to be as transparent as possible and say that I do personally identify as a Christian. I don't think that is central to my main argument that I'm going to be making in this video. This video is not trying to evangelize to anyone. It's not claiming that you should convert to one religion versus another. It is strictly about this organization, which is the Black Church, that it has its foundation in principles that are related to social justice, and therefore gives it a mandate to do a much better job than it's doing right now to address social ill. And as we'll see in this video essay coming soon, I have the facts to prove that its foundation has always been and should continue to be in the principles of socialism. The Black masses are in the churches. That's a quote from James H. Cone, a theological scholar who wrote Black Consciousness and the Black Church. I resonate with this quote, and some might say that it's kind of outdated because currently there are a lot of statistics out there that show that church attendance and membership has declined significantly, especially among Black Americans. And I'm going to focus on Black America in this conversation, although I do think that this is relevant to the African diaspora. This quote is still accurate to me in that the Black masses are in the churches. Not necessarily to say that we are identifying as church members per se, but turn on the television anytime there's a new headline about a Black woman, a Black man, or unfortunately a child being harmed by the state in one way or the other. You'll normally see a lawyer and next to him a leader of a church, a pastor, if the lawyer is not already a pastor himself. Even in a situation where society is getting more and more secularized, there is a portion, if not a larger portion, of the Black community that still sees the Black church as a haven for respite, for justice, for speaking out against the crimes against their community. And if the Black church still holds this level of status today, I think it's essential for us to have a serious conversation about how it could be sharpened as a better weapon against injustice. James H. Cone also says this: the church is a community of sufferers in any society which believes in and lives on the basis of a reality of liberation that is not recognized by the ruling class. Now, for context, it's important to note that the ruling class, according to James H. Cone, was Eurocentric culture or white supremacist culture. This quote takes it even further for me in terms of the importance of the Black church and why I feel it was necessary to create a whole video about its place in this topic on socialism. Those who definitely identify as church members, those who do identify as Christians, are torn, I think, where there's a schism right now between those who do strongly believe that we're supposed to operate as a community, that everyone is responsible for each other, brother and sister, looking out for one another. But there's a growing majority that are thinking more on an individualistic level. That is very much in line with the way the ruling class operates.
Of destiny. Nothing works without somebody at work. Work. God the Father, work. God the Son, work. So where are you coming from? You find believers doing nothing. I'm believing God. I'm believing God. God is just laughing. Whatever your hand findeth to do with all your might. People are just hiding under nonsense. They call it faith. Those who place pressure before labor, they live perpetually under pressure.
Which is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Figure it out on your own. You are in charge of your own salvation. And if there's something going wrong in your life or around you, then it might be because of individual sin. That worries me a lot and makes me feel that is putting the Black community in a much more vulnerable state than it has ever been before, especially coming out of the civil rights movement and thinking about the way that the church was so vital in coming together and bringing communities together to establish a lot of the laws today that give us some of the rights that we would have never had if not for their sacrifice. I would hate and find it very shameful if the Black church continued to go down this path of emulating the ruling class rather than going to its core principles of looking out for the least of us and also looking out for the community as a whole. My thesis for this conversation is going to be, what if the church dug deep back down into its history? Would that cause a necessary revival? And would that also lead the church to really stand firmly on the principles of socialist movements in America and across the diaspora? And also, what is stopping the Black church right now from seeing socialism as a more immediate way to make an impact on eliminating all social inequality permanently? So I guess I'll start by just thinking about past methods that the Black church has used and rate them for effectiveness and see how closely to the, if you want to use this analogy, to the left or to the right that they were. Left being more leaning towards socialism/communism, and right being more conservative principles around individualistic responsibility. James H. Cone wrote about the pre-Civil War Black churches recognizing the importance of mutual aid and support. I'll specifically quote from his book once again. "The Christian gospel is a gospel of liberation. The pre-Civil War Black churches recognized this, and that was why they refused to accept an interpretation of Christianity that was unrelated to civil freedom." According to the United Church of Christ website, even when there were Calvinist church sects opposing slavery, at least starting in the 17th century, Black congregants, free or not free, still did not feel welcomed as human souls within the church community. Whether they were slaves or they were free men, they did not feel like the Calvinist having an opposition to slavery still meant that they were welcome as valued souls within the church congregation. This is what led them to then found their own African churches, and people such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were featured speakers at these churches. And within this model, there was a mutual aid system. And I'll quote this again directly from the UCC's website. Black church ministers were not only pastors and preachers to their congregations, but were social workers and organizers for human rights as well. That right there shows me that there was something about the church that aligned more, so what James H. Cone would call the ruling class, that did not sit well with Black congregants, which made them leave and then create a version of church that is very much aligned with principles that you would see in writings that were popular at the time, because this was happening during the late 1800s when concepts such as socialism and communism were coming into fruition through Karl Marx publishing The Poverty of Philosophy, in which he actually directly criticizes the transatlantic slave trade as a capitalistic enterprise, and he was an active abolitionist himself. Then he goes on, of course, to publish with Frederick Engels the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And then we also have anarchist Peter, and I don't know how to pronounce his name, so it will be on the screen, from Russia, who promoted decentralized cooperatives or mutual aid societies in 1871. So all of this is happening around the same time. However, there doesn't seem to be a clear line connecting these African churches directly to Karl Marx or any, for lack of a better word, white-led or non-Black-led socialist movements. There was a piece that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote on the connection between abolition and communism, which I thought was very insightful. And it says, "It was common to hear abolitionists called communist and to hear communists accused of abolitionism. In the mid-19th century, the abolitionists, often property holders or even small employers, repudiated all thought of disturbing the current industrial system, but declared that the system should not include slaves. On the other side, the communists and radicals drew away from abolitionists and declared that they were forgetting white wage slaves for the interest of a few Black slaves who were not worth freedom. It was not until after the Civil War that Karl Marx drew these separating ideologies together." So that is very interesting to note, that the controversy around being labeled either an abolitionist or a communist kind of stratified people who are technically on the same team. And it's also important to note that those who were communists, their politics, even though they were labeled as communists, was actually probably more closely leaning towards the right in terms of their individualistic protection versus being more leftist and radical and saying that this freedom that we're fighting for is not just for us, but for all men and women, regardless of race. Karl Marx did want Black members, i.e. newly free slaves, to become members of trade unions in the United States that were fighting with white working class members to end this, what he called capitalistic enterprise that was abusive. However, he noted that many of the white members of these trade unions refused to integrate. From my research, no direct relationship between Black abolitionists in the church, Karl Marx, or any other communist groups in the late 1800s. However, if anyone knows of any sources that do show any direct line of communication, especially, and collaboration between them, please do drop it in the comments because I would love to read that. So we see here, basically, in summary, that the Black church from the 1800s was practicing some form of socialism, whether they called it that or not. They were looking out for each other's needs. Pastors were holding many hats, were being social workers and community organizers, were fighting actively for the well-being of their larger community. Fast forward to the Civil Rights era and the Cold War. Sadly, our hero Martin Luther King Jr., probably the most quintessential example of the Black church being at the helm of Black liberation, said that communism and Christianity are fundamentally incompatible. He probably felt that sincerely because of the pressure on Americans to avoid being associated with the Russians during the Cold War, or at that time they were called the Soviets. But he also explicitly said that the cold atheism wrapped up in communism that provided no place for God or Christ led him away from it. So in MLK's interpretation, he did not dislike the take on social justice that communism had, nor did he even disagree with its case against capitalism. He just felt that it was emptied of any religion, spirituality, and didn't have God at its core, which made it fundamentally opposed to his principles. He then went on to say that socialists or socialism was a safer label or term than communism, which is very interesting because when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, he uses socialism and communism interchangeably. But according to Britannica.com, they claim that Karl Marx's first phase of communism tends to be what people associate more with socialism, the less extreme version of Karl Marx's call for the proletariat. And so to quote, they say that his first phase of communism was the working class controlling the government and economy, yet still paying people according to how long, hard, or well they worked. Capitalism and private property exist, though to a limited degree. Whether or not you feel that goes far enough is another debate that we can have at another time. However, that is what people felt more safer to associate with Martin Luther King, for example. With all of that being said, we don't even have to go to philosophers. We don't even have to go to these political leaders to try to figure out what fundamentally is at the core of Christianity, or whether or not socialism has its place at the core of Christianity. Because, and again, per Britannica.com, not just me saying this, the first Christians practiced a simpler form of communism, where the common good of the whole was more important than how well the individual was doing. Case in fact, just go straight to scripture. Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47 reads, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold their property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved." Right there is basically the answer to what I'm saying about the decline in church membership and the decline in the way that the church, Black church specifically, is showing up on behalf of those in need. Socialism can be the solution both to the church's social political relevance and the malaise that millennials and Gen Zers are feeling towards society currently. Pew Research Center says that adults ages 18 to 49 years old are more likely to say that they seldom or never attend church. A 2020 Pew Research study says that teens are more likely to say they go to church because they have to or because their parents say so versus because they want to. The teens who identify more with a Democratic or left-leaning party mindset are less religious than those aligned with Republicans. Lastly, Christianity Today reported that Black Protestant church attendance also declined since the beginning of the pandemic and is significantly lower than white evangelicals. And all of this is happening at the same time that millennials and Gen Zers are being more vocal about their disgust and their unhappiness with a capitalistic society. In 2019, Axios found that 70% of millennials would vote for a socialist politician. In 2021, Newsweek found that 54% of Gen Zers surveyed had a negative view of capitalism, including, surprisingly, those identifying as Republicans. So am I advocating for the Black church to just adopt socialism as a ploy to get more seats in the pews and raise more funds for their building, etc.? No. I am advocating for genuine leaders who are sincerely concerned with the well-being of their congregants to listen to basically what this new generation that's coming up is saying. Thinking about the fact that because the church is moving further and further away from addressing those issues, they are coming more and more disinclined to want to associate with the church. And if the church's mandate scripturally says that they're supposed to be for the sufferers, for those who are lacking, and are supposed to, as Acts said, sell off anything to make sure that everyone's fed and well taken care of, this is something that they might have to consider very seriously, adopting an approach that's much more radical than what they've been used to in the more recent history of church groups. So if you want to attract more younger congregants who are on fire, not just for Christ or for God, but also going to see the church as effect real change, we need to start talking about how socialism can be preached and talked about at the pulpit. This, I believe, will create a more shared reality across not just groups within the Black community, but social groups and classes across race and class lines, because it's not just Black congregants who are thinking about this. There are several white and non-Black church congregants who are also starting to get dissuaded by the church's lack of urgency in addressing the social issues that are happening right now. And this could be the new coalition necessary to enact those reforms that we desperately need for these marginalized communities. And also just going back to James H. Cone's statement about the Black masses being the church, I would go further to say that they are the catalyst, the cultural catalyst most of the time. So there could be a domino effect of the Black church galvanizing people from multiple walks of life to actually create revolutionary change. Call this a reach, but I think the same way that the Black community has been a catalyst for cultural change in both music, entertainment, social media, is the same way that the Black church eventually could become that catalyst for real social change when it comes to social political issues. This part of the video is the hardest for me to film, but I think it's necessary to not just talk about the statistics and the history and the political or socioeconomic arguments about this topic. It's also very, very important to put a human face to this issue. I graduated along with many others during one of the worst economic recessions in American history, or in world history, to be honest. I was fed the promise, especially as a child of immigrants, that if you just worked really hard, did what you were supposed to do, studied really hard, and went to a top-tier four-year college, you were almost guaranteed a life of comfort and success with your college degree. I also believed, as a person of faith, that if I continued to pray to God and ask Him for His support, that He would lead me in the right direction in choosing the correct career path and the right job. Unfortunately, I was among many of those who did not get a job right out of college. And since then, I feel like I was in a perpetual rat race trying to catch up and make up for lost time. Society as a whole doesn't necessarily wait for things to get together and for you to get your life together before it asks you to own up to some responsibilities, like paying bills, like finding a place to live and not leeching, quote unquote, off of the government for support. And so even when I turned to government assistance and that ran out, and when I turned to friends and family and that help ran out, I was hoping that the church that I was attending would be a line of support. Because again, we're supposed to be there for those who are suffering. We're supposed to be feeding the poor, looking out for the orphans, etc. I'm not saying this out of spite or out of revenge to anyone who might know who I'm talking about when I refer to this story. I'm just sharing an example of why it is so crucial for the Black church, especially, to re-examine its philosophy around work, around grit, around prosperity, around faith, and around charity. At a time when I was in need, when I had been laid off from yet another job and was left with no more resources to pull from government assistance or even friends and family, I decided to turn to the church that I was attending for support. Instead, I was often met with just prayers and "we'll be there for you, we're thinking of you," thoughts and prayers. And when I was vulnerable enough to confront church leadership about how desperate I was and how sad I felt from the lack of support from the community in my time of need, I was basically excommunicated and told that I was trying to embarrass or shame the church leadership. It's those kind of things that really make me understand and empathize with people who want to leave the church. I have had too many experiences in my personal life to be someone who would deny that God exists. And that's just my personal belief. You can take it as you will. As someone who believes that she's a child of God, I still find it very hard to find community with the rest of his children. Socialism is a starting point that is rooted and grounded in scripture for the church to go back, recalibrate, and rethink its approach to building community and support systems in a world that is merciless when it comes to providing support to the poor. For those of you on the non-religious side who believe that the church is just too corrupt to ever get to that state, I implore you to re-examine that kind of thought, especially based on the scriptures that I've given. Again, not to evangelize to you and say that you need to convert to one religion or the other, but to realize that many foundational beliefs of groups of people are rooted and grounded in genuine, authentic love and support for your fellow human being. And so the point of this video is not to disparage any kind of organized religion. The goal is to hopefully tell a compassionate, from the heart story, backed with some statistics and some actual history, to motivate us to do better, to be better on behalf of those who need it the most.